Hi, my name is Ren, and welcome to my first ever booktube video. As you might have surmised by me starting a booktube channel, I hold near and dear two great loves of life: incessant reading and enthused yapping. So I'm really excited to be able to combine those two and start a booktube channel. There's something really intensely personal about reading and about literature, how wonderfully an intimate and unparalleled experience it is for the author, through asynchronous words on a page, to be able to speak directly into a reader's mind. And the reader can examine the interior of characters' minds that's portrayed and kaleidoscoped through the author's narration. But for as personal literature is, it's also inherently collective. Its exigence is born from the society in which it was created. Good literature demands to be reckoned with, pondered individually, but also talked about at loud and at length with others, because good literature has the power to not only affect us individually, but us collectively. I think that's one of the core contentions of both Demon Copperhead and David Copperfield. And even though these are stories about, one young boy, it's actually a story about a whole generation and advocacy to change the status quo. While reading has always been an intensely personal thing for me, I am really excited to now step more into exploring what literature can look like collectively. Booktube specifically is a really unique and special community, and as an avid watcher, I just had a yearning to participate more fully in it. And so I'm really glad that you clicked on this video, and hopefully you'll consider going on this journey with me. For my first video, I thought that it would just be fitting to talk about my most recent read, which I finished a couple days ago, which is Demon Copperhead by Kingsolver. And before you say anything, I know I am so late to the game on this one, this being published in 2022, winning the 2023 Pulitzer, and it almost being 2025 now. But in my paltry defense, I was on the David Copperfield grind since its OG, forever. Definitely not since its publishing, because I was still alive then, but ever since high school when I picked up and read Dickens in the first place. I had actually first read Great Expectations, but since then I've been hooked. Demon Copperhead, if you don't know, is a modern day adaptation of David Copperfield. I think David Copperfield is my most favorite Dickens novel, and Dickens himself said that David Copperfield was his favorite child. I do think it's funny that Charles Dickens would be a parent who had a favorite child and would say that to his children. This narrative voice was so compelling. I was finally cognizant about the fact that authorial voice was a thing in books, and it wasn't just character voice. The characters could be different, but the authorial voice remained, and I fell in love with him as an author. Usually I will say that I have absolutely no real basis for the strong opinions that I have loosely held. However, in this case, if I am qualified to yap about literally one thing in life, it is probably Victorian literature, i.e. Charles Dickens. But the second thing that you should know about me is that I am a fiend for the Bildungsroman. The Bildungsroman is my Roman Empire. Both of these books are notably Bildungsromans, coming-of-age novels. And I literally wrote my grad school essay about the Bildungsroman, which I guess doesn't sound that patently crazy until you realize that I am a computer science major. So it was a stretch to be able to cram that into my essay. If I've learned anything from the Bildungsroman, it is the power of indomitable will, namely about childlike belief in the way that things should be and how that can vanquish even the most insurmountable of foes. Namely, in Bildungsromans, it's mostly adults and how evil they are, and then how they then create systems that are evil that then further entrench the status quo, which is evil, but be the change. The TLDR is that I am incredibly late to the game on this book, but maybe there can be a silver lining. If you've already read this book, evaluate me. If I have bad takes, please tell me. I would love to debate you on them, or to be convinced by you. And also, if you haven't read this book, then hopefully this will tip you in either direction as 2025 resolution season comes around. Anyways, I think it is incredibly serendipitous to start off my booktube talking about my newest favorite novel and one of my oldest favorite novels, and this is quite literally an adaptation of this. And so I just feel like it's very auspicious and full circle. And so let's get into it and start talking about Demon Copperhead. I had a really different experience with the first half and the latter half of this book. In the first half of the book, Kingsolver comes out swinging with a really strong narrative voice. And I think in the beginning it was a little bit hard to get into, to sink my fangs into Copperhead, as you will. And I say this as a distinction because I don't think in the beginning it was Demon Copperhead, the titular protagonist, that was really driving this voice. Demon Copperhead, as a narrator, had so much potential, and I think a lot of that is either overdone or underdone. So in the beginning, I think a lot of that is overdone, and you feel like Barbara Kingsolver's voice is super loud before we can even acquaint ourselves with who Demon Copperhead is as a character. So it feels like her authorial voice specifically is louder than the narrator's voice. And then halfway through the novel, it sort of shifts, where especially when she's talking about the opioid crisis, she focuses more on telling the reader about how bad the opioid crisis is objectively, which I think that's a really fair thing to do. But in telling, she doesn't really let Damon talk about his personal story as much. I was watching an interview that Barbara Kingsolver was having about this book with Oprah, and explaining about how the ghost of Charles Dickens talked to her and says, I quote, "Let the child tell the story." I do think what's kind of unfortunate about the first half is I don't think that Barbara Kingsolver let the child tell the story enough. I think a huge part of that is sort of this like hazy retelling. I think she tense shifts a lot in like the awareness sense. So usually in the Bildungsroman genre, the character's consciousness evolves as they get older. Namely, when you're a child and something happens, you don't have the same understanding of what was going on as like an adult would, right? You just like miss things because you're a kid. And I think the problem is that this story is written retrospectively. So there is some like demon in the future that is writing the story about how he grew up. The problem is that sometimes he slips into, hey, I'm a kid, and so I didn't understand this. But then sometimes he has these really profound insights that only an adult would have had. He like observes things as a child that is not realistic to the fact that a child would not have understood this. Here's a good example of this. He says, quote, in chapter 3, "What I don't remember is what I didn't know. How does it feel to turn legal drinking age and already be 3 years into AA? How much does it suck to have a school-age kid and a long-term relationship with the Walmart party supplies aisle while the friends you used to have are still running around looking to get high or drunk or married, ideally some perfect combo of the three." These are really good lines. Like, this is really well done, and he's so conscious of the fact that he didn't know that at the time, and he like very clearly points it out to you, which I appreciate. But then there are other things that are like continuing on, like the next page goes, "Then comes along Stoner, his mom's new, at the time, boyfriend, claiming he respects a clean woman, looking something like Mr. Clean himself. In her mind, a ripped bald guy in a denim vest and no shirt was the be-all end-all of manhood. If you're surprised a mom would discuss boyfriend hotness with a kid still learning not to pick his nose, you've not seen the far end of lonely. I thought smoking with mom and discussing various men's stud factors was a sign of deep respect. So I came to know things. A whole head with a 5 o'clock shadow. Dead sexy." That's really good. Honestly, like I really liked that. I underlined that. I think that's fun. But the problem is that like you're saying here that the kid doesn't know not to pick his nose, but at the same time, he's discussing boyfriend hotness with his mom and that he understands it's a sign of deep respect. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there where it's like, how old were you and how much did you understand at the time? How much of that is retrospective narration? Like you understand now and so you're inserting that in. It shifts a lot in the beginning, and I think that kind of unstable ground is reason why it's really hard to immerse yourself. As the novel is kind of inconsistent in its narration, you kind of get whiplash when something is not quite right. Part of my reason why it was a little bit jarring in the beginning, and how I've actually Demon Copperhead has really grown on me as a novel as I've pondered more about it. But my context was that I was previously reading a lot of bildungsromans where it was intensely autobiographical. Dickens is quite literally writing about his life and the sequence of his life. Then previously over the summer, I had read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, same thing. This Side of Paradise by Fitzgerald, same thing, where they're writing bildungsromans, but they're writing about themselves. And in that way, I think the author has a bit of an opposite problem where like the character's voice is so its own because the author is the character. I think the battle in those novels specifically is there's too much of a blurring between the author and the narrator, and I think the author tries to extricate themselves from the plot but is unable to do so because they're quite literally talking autobiographically. However, I think Barbara has the opposite problem where she, even though she grew up in Appalachia and that is her community, I think her as an author is not the same as Damon or Demon, and I think that's not a bad thing. I just think that it creates a different dynamic in the narrative that was present, and in the beginning I think it lost my immersiveness, But if you choose to decide to immerse yourself in what's going on, the narrative says really important things, and I think it's definitely worth reading. When I say that it's a little bit contrived and that Kingsolver's narrative voice is overbearing, I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. I just think that in the beginning it's really hard to get immersed into the novel. But I think once you decide to just commit to the bit, it ameliorates very quickly and it actually becomes a very fun read. My turning point in the novel, I'm slightly ashamed to say this, but it was very arbitrary and petty. I would like to say it's like the complex characterization, the building of Demon as like a character, and like the plot progression, the pacing, but it was in fact this quote specifically, quote, "Genghis got me amazing comics, including a manga series of a kid named Goldilocks on a journey to find his dad that left whenever he was a baby and was said to have superpowers. Obviously a hit." When I tell you that I quite literally screamed out loud, that inside of this book, casually, unsuspecting, there was a Hunter x Hunter anime reference, like manga reference, I just like I lost myself. Like, I was like, this is Pulitzer winning fiction, which was funny because it incidentally is. Like, I didn't know we could do that. I didn't know, I don't read a lot of contemporary stuff, so I didn't know you could just like insert anime references. Like, the amount of excitement that I felt, like, I think from that page 248, I was just sold. I was like, I don't care, this is a good time. Demon is a really fun narrator. He's punchy, he has this caustic wit, he balances this like harrowing circumstances that he's going through with just this kind of like detached sense of wry humor, and I think the entire thing is a really easy read. It's fast, I really like it. I've seen a couple Goodreads reviews of Demon Copperhead, and I think the most prevalent pejorative review of Demon Copperhead is that she is not subtle at all about how evil she feels the like opioid crisis was, the fault of the pharmaceutical industry that was quite literally targeting specifically Appalachia and trying to get them to be abusers. I think the problem is that she loses a lot of subtlety when talking about the opioid addiction, and part of it shifts from being a narrative about this young boy to her quite literally through other characters in the novel basically going on like tirades kind of directly to the reader, explaining how this went down, or a little bit tell not show. In the end, a lot of people have argued that she gets a little bit soapboxy, and it feels like the narrative that was already slightly contrived in the beginning, because it is an adaptation and so she has to like fit the plot points, then becomes incredibly heavy-handed. I think this introduces a really important point about what the role of literature should be. There's two sides of the argument, I think, at the risk of overgeneralization. There's like the Oscar Wilde definition where literature is inherently useless. It's like how a flower, you know, blossoms. It has no utility and yet is valuable. I'm totally like butchering that quote. Then you have on the other side of the spectrum what W.E.B. Du Bois argues is that like all literature is propaganda. Literature should be towards some goal to affect some social change. In that way, it is considered propaganda, not pejoratively, but inherently. I think Barbara Kingsolver would, in this novel, is more on the W.E.B. Du Bois side. I can't necessarily blame Kingsolver for being, you know, preferring to take the hit on the fictional immersiveness side if it means driving home a factual point about a really important historical event, both objectively but also subjectively to her as someone who is from that region of Appalachia and sees the devastating effects of the opioid crisis has on her community. Dickens, David Copperfield, goes about it in a different way, where his story and his plight feel incredibly individual, but then you realize later it's actually part of this like larger institutionalized narrative of boys of his day. I feel acutely bad for David Copperfield, who seems like there's like a string of kind of arbitrary and endless bad things that happened to him, trauma. Through the incredibly specific details of this one boy, you realize that there are larger societal evils that Dickens is talking toward. It's a little bit like how Olivia Rodrigo, and she'll include these really specific details about her breakup that you like we can't relate to, but by including those specific unrelatable details, her songs in essence are more relatable. Like, there is that increased immersion, if that makes sense. Whereas I feel like Barbara Kingsolver kind of does the opposite, where she starts doing that off in the beginning, but then in the latter half of the narration, especially with like the opioid crisis, I feel like she loses a bit of her subtlety. The narration stops focusing on the interior of Demon's mind, but then starts looking outward about how, you know, the opioid crisis is affecting the community in total. And so you get these like wide view shots of people who are at clinics, for example, where the doctor is prescribing them opioid medication for the sole purpose of exploiting them. So I understand the decision that she made there, but I do think it was a decision that had trade-offs. And I think it comes to this point of like, well, does her talking about the opioid addiction have to be subtle? Like, honestly, I think that's just her prerogative of an author, where she's decided that the facts, like portraying the facts of the narrative, are more important than your immersiveness as a reader. I think she makes a stance and is really trying to tell America something, and she would rather err on the side of over telling us something than under telling us. And in that sort of erring, I think she sometimes errs on the fictional immersiveness or subtlety front. I think that's a really fine authorial take, but I do want to preface it that I thought that was present in the novel. In conclusion, overall, like, Demon Copperhead is a really faithful adaptation to David Copperfield. Like, the plot is the same, the spirit of the novel is the same, the characters are usually like one letter that's like flipped or something, like Angus is like Agnes. I think the biggest difference between this book and David Copperfield is that genuinely the narrators are just different in nature. What is so characteristic about this book is David Copperfield as a main character. He is the quintessential Dickens protagonist that is good-natured, golden boy, good kid. Having experienced the harshness of the world, he in turn repays it with goodness, and that changes the world around him for the better. On the other hand, Demon is clever. He has this dry, biting, caustic wit. He's a little bit hostile against the world around him. He has a much more cynical and brash exterior, and so you can tell that deep down he's a good kid, but he presents honestly like a smart ass. He's not quintessentially affable or like David Copperfield, and so there's still a more like shadowed edge to what is very deep down his good character. Both Dickens and Kingsolver are incredibly conscious about the fact that this is a bildungsroman of one boy's experience growing up, but it is to speak to a generation. It provides larger social commentary of the systems of inequity and oppression that affect this boy. I do think that Demon Copperhead is a timely and timeless narrative. So timely in the sense that especially right when she wrote it back in 2022, the rural-urban divide, it was and is still a huge issue facing America. If anything, she was really prescient about that as we come very close to the election. The people, especially in Appalachia and especially rural America, feeling like they don't have a narrative of themselves, how they feel like they don't relate to, don't have the empathy or the attention of the people that's living in the cities. I think that's such a timely narrative, and I think she wrote it at a really important inflection point in America. I also think it's a timeless narrative, notwithstanding the fact that it's quite literally an adaptation of a narrative that was written in 1849. But I think this idea of just like a bildungsroman, a story about an unlikely hero who is beleaguered by both personal and institutionalized evils, but comes of age in a world that is neither inviting nor pleased of his existence, but he decides to forge his own world nonetheless, a better one despite the odds. I think that's always a narrative that will be important for us to read and to contend with and to both ponder individually and collectively. I hope you enjoyed my kind of disjointed analysis of this book. I thought it would be fitting to end on two of my favorite quotes from both of the novels that I feel like really sum up the kind of spirit that these authors, I think, are trying to say with these pieces. So first, quotes from Demon Copperhead. I've tried in this retelling, time and time again, to pinpoint the moment where everything starts to fall apart, everything meaning me. But there's also the opposite, where some little nut cracks open inside you and a tree starts to grow, even harder to nail. Because that thing's going to be growing a long time before you notice, years maybe. Then one day you say, that little crack between my ears has turned into a whole damn tree of wonderful. Another quote. Never be mean in anything. Never be false. Never be cruel. I can always be hopeful of you. That's actually one of the direct quotes from David Copperfield, which I feel like is really beautiful. And then finally, I just want to end with two quotes from my long-standing friend, David Copperfield. What I want you to be, I don't mean physically, but morally. You are very well physically, is a firm fellow, a firm, fine fellow, with a will of your own and resolution, with determination, with strength of character that is not to be influenced, except on good reason by anyone or by anything. That's what I want you to be. That's what your father and your mother might both have been. And then finally, I hope that simple love and truth will be strong in the end. I hope that real love and truth are stronger in the end than any evil or misfortune in the world. thank you for watching. If you feel so inclined, please feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. But honestly, thank you just for watching, and I'll catch you next time.